an original story narrated exclusively for Love Written in Silence. Hannah Moreland stands at the edge of the churchyard in the cold morning light, her black mourning dress damp from the mist that clings to the gravestones. Her hands shake as she clutches a worn prayer book, though she has not opened it in weeks. Behind her, the Duke of Renborough descends from his carriage, his face drawn and pale, his shoulders bent beneath the weight of something no title can shield him from. They do not look at each other. They have never spoken. But every Sunday for nearly a year, they have sat in the same pew, separated only by the width of grief itself. The village watches them both with a mixture of pity and suspicion, whispering behind gloved hands about failures and absences and losses too great to name. Today, the Duke pauses at the church door. He turns his head slightly, just enough to see her silhouette against the gray sky. And for the first time, something shifts in the silence between them. Hannah Moreland arrived at St. Catherine's Parish Church each Sunday at precisely 9:30. She walked alone from the edge of the village where her small cottage stood, its windows still dark, even in daylight. The walk took 20 minutes. She counted her steps sometimes, when the silence became too heavy to bear. Other times she simply moved through the world, as though she were a shadow passing over stone. The church itself was old, built of gray limestone that had weathered centuries of rain and wind. The windows were tall and narrow, their glass thick and rippled with age. Light came through them in pale shafts that did little to warm the interior. The pews were oak, dark and solid, worn smooth by generations of hands and knees and sorrows. Hannah always sat in the third pew from the front, on the left side. She had not chosen this place. It had been her husband's pew, and before him, his father's. When her husband died of consumption 7 years ago, she had continued to sit there. When her son Thomas died 6 months ago, she had not moved. She did not know how to sit anywhere else. The Duke of Renborough sat in the same pew. He arrived each Sunday at 9:45, entering through the side door that led directly from the estate path. He did not use the main entrance. He did not greet the vicar or acknowledge the villagers who turned to watch him pass. He simply walked down the aisle with measured steps, his boots barely making a sound on the stone floor, and took his place at the far end of the third pew. There was room for 4 people between them. Neither moved closer, neither moved away. The congregation noticed, of course. The village of Ashford was small, fewer than 300 souls, and the Duke's return after 2 years in London had been the subject of intense speculation. His wife had died there. Consumption, some said. Childbed fever, others whispered. No one knew for certain. The Duke had not spoken of it. He had simply returned to Renborough Hall one cold October morning, shuttered and silent, and begun attending services as though he had never left. Hannah had been sitting in that pew for months by then. Her son had died in late winter, when the snow lay thick on the ground and the roads were impassable. He had been 8 years old. The fever had taken him in 3 days. There had been no medicine. The dispensary had run out of supplies weeks before, and the estate's usual provisions had not arrived. The Duke had been in London. The steward had been overwhelmed. The village had suffered. Hannah did not blame the Duke. She did not have the energy for blame. Grief had hollowed her out so completely that there was no room left for anger. She simply existed, week after week, sitting in the cold church and listening to words that no longer reached her. The Duke, for his part, never looked at her. He kept his eyes forward, his gloved hands folded in his lap. His face was gaunt, the skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. His hair, once dark, was threaded with gray. He was perhaps 35, though he looked older. Grief aged a man, just as it aged a woman. It carved lines into the face and bent the spine and dimmed the light behind the eyes. The villagers watched them both. They pitied Hannah, who had lost so much and carried it with such quiet dignity. They were less certain about the Duke. Some thought his attendance at church was a sign of genuine repentance. Others believed it was mere duty, the performance of a man who had failed his people and now sought to repair his reputation. Hannah did not think about it. She did not think about much anymore. She rose each morning because the day required it. She tended her small garden because the plants would die otherwise. She walked to church because it was Sunday. She sat in the pew, because it was where she had always sat, and the Duke sat beside her, silent and separate, carrying his own weight. The church was cold, even in summer. The stone walls held the chill of centuries. In winter, it was nearly unbearable. Hannah wore her heaviest shawl, but it did little to keep out the damp. Her fingers ached. Her feet went numb. She did not complain. She did not speak to anyone. After the service, she would rise and walk back down the aisle, her eyes fixed on the door. The other women would nod to her, their faces soft with sympathy. The men would step aside to let her pass. No one tried to engage her in conversation. They had learned, over the months, that she did not wish to be comforted. The Duke left through the side door. He did not linger. He did not speak to the vicar or join the small gatherings that formed in the churchyard. He simply disappeared, as silent as he had arrived. And so it went, Sunday after Sunday. The same pew, the same silence, the same ache that neither of them could name. Hannah had stopped crying months ago. The tears had dried up, leaving only a dull, persistent pain that sat in her chest like a stone. She went through the motions of her life, with mechanical precision. She woke, she dressed, she ate sparingly. She worked in the garden. She walked to the village square on market days, though she rarely bought anything. She attended church. The rhythm of it was almost soothing. There were no surprises, no sudden joys or sorrows, just the steady, unrelenting sameness of grief. The Duke, she imagined, felt much the same. She did not know him. She had never spoken to him. But she recognized the way he held himself, the careful rigidity of his posture, the way his jaw tightened during the hymns. He was a man who had learned to contain his pain, to carry it without letting it spill over into the world around him. They were alike in that way. Both of them had become experts in silence. The villagers had begun to speak of them in the same breath. Poor Mrs. Moreland, they would say, shaking their heads. And the Duke, of course, both of them lost in their grief. It was said with a kind of reverent pity, as though grief were a place one could get lost in, like a forest or a fog. Hannah supposed it was true. She felt lost most days. She moved through the world without direction, without purpose. The only anchor she had was the routine, the same pew, the same silence, the same slow passage of time. And the Duke, sitting at the other end of the pew, was the only other person who seemed to understand. The village of Ashford had always depended on Renborough Hall. The estate was vast, encompassing nearly 2,000 acres of farmland, woodland, and pasture. The Duke's family had held the land for generations, and with it came responsibilities. The estate provided work for the tenant farmers, wages for the household staff, and support for the village in times of need. When the old Duke had been alive, the relationship between the estate and the village had been stable, even warm. He had been a fair man, known for his generosity during hard winters and his willingness to listen to grievances. When he died, his son had inherited not only the title, but also the expectations that came with it. The new Duke had tried at first. He had been young, barely 25, when he assumed the title. He had married within a year, a woman from a respectable family in London. They had settled at Renborough Hall and had seemed, by all accounts, content. But then his wife had fallen ill. The illness had been slow and cruel, dragging on for more than a year. The Duke had taken her to London, seeking the best physicians, spending a fortune on treatments that did nothing. He had stayed by her side, leaving the estate in the hands of his steward. The steward had done his best, but he was not the Duke. He did not have the authority to make certain decisions, and he lacked the personal relationships that had smoothed over difficulties in the past. When the hard winter came and supplies ran low, the steward hesitated. He sent letters to London, asking for instructions. The letters went unanswered. The Duke was consumed by his wife's suffering. The village suffered in silence. Families went without. The dispensary ran out of medicine. Children fell ill, and Thomas Moreland, 8 years old, died of a fever that might have been cured if there had been quinine. Hannah had not blamed the Duke. She had not blamed anyone. Blame required energy, and she had none to spare. But the village remembered. The village always remembered. When the Duke returned, some had expected an apology. Others had expected nothing at all. What they got was silence. The Duke resumed his duties quietly, without fanfare. He attended council meetings. He authorized repairs to tenant cottages. He ensured that the dispensary was restocked. But he did not speak of the past. He did not acknowledge the failures. And so the village watched him, uncertain. Was he a man seeking redemption, or simply a man going through the motions, as hollow as the rest of them? Hannah did not know. She did not care. Her world had shrunk to the size of her grief. The Duke was simply another figure in the landscape, as distant and untouchable as the hills beyond the village. She had been a seamstress once, before Thomas was born. She had worked in the village, mending clothes and sewing dresses for the women who could afford them. After her husband died, she had continued the work, supporting herself and her son. But after Thomas died, she had put down her needle. Her hands had forgotten how to hold it steady. Now she volunteered at the dispensary 3 days a week. It was not paid work, but it gave her something to do. She sorted supplies, cleaned shelves, and occasionally assisted the pharmacist with preparing simple remedies. The work was quiet and undemanding. No one expected her to smile or make conversation. She was simply there, a presence in the background, useful but unobtrusive. The pharmacist, Mr. Dawson, was a kind man in his 60s. He had known Hannah since she was a girl. He did not pry. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He simply let her work, and for that she was grateful. The dispensary was a small building near the village square, little more than a single room, with shelves lining the walls and a counter at the front. It smelled of herbs and alcohol and old wood. The light was dim, filtered through a single window that faced north. Hannah found it peaceful. She was there on a Wednesday afternoon, organizing jars of dried chamomile, when Mr. Dawson mentioned, almost offhandedly, that a large delivery had arrived that morning. Quinine, he said, holding up a bottle, and willow bark, laudanum, even some mercury compounds. I haven't seen a shipment this generous in years. Hannah glanced up. From where? The estate, Mr. Dawson said. He set the bottle down and picked up another. The Duke himself sent word, said to order whatever we needed, and he would cover the cost. Hannah's hand stilled. She did not reply. Mr. Dawson continued, his tone thoughtful. He didn't make a fuss about it. Just sent a letter to the supplier in Exeter, very specific about what was needed, almost as if someone had told him exactly what to order. Hannah looked down at the jar in her hands. Her throat felt tight. Strange, isn't it? Mr. Dawson said. A man who's barely spoken to anyone in months, suddenly taking such an interest in the dispensary. Hannah set the jar on the shelf with careful precision. Perhaps he's simply doing his duty. Perhaps, Mr. Dawson said, but his tone suggested he thought otherwise. Hannah did not respond. She returned to her work, her movements steady and deliberate. But her mind was elsewhere, turning over the information like a stone in her hand. The Duke had ordered supplies, specific supplies, supplies that would have saved her son. She did not know what to do with that knowledge. She did not know if it changed anything, but it sat in her chest, heavy and strange, and she could not shake it loose. The first words came on a Sunday in late autumn. The air was crisp, the leaves on the trees had turned gold and red, and the light slanting through the church windows was the color of honey. The service had ended, and the congregation was filing out into the churchyard, their breath misting in the cold air. Hannah walked alone, as always. She kept her head down, her hands tucked into her shawl. She was halfway to the gate when she heard a voice behind her. Mrs. Moreland. She stopped. The voice was low, quiet, but unmistakable. She turned slowly. The Duke of Renborough stood a few paces away. He had removed his hat and held it in his hands. His face was pale, his expression unreadable. He looked at her steadily, without apology or hesitation. "Forgive the intrusion," he said. "I wonder if I might ask you a question." Hannah's heart was beating too fast. She nodded, unable to speak. The Duke took a step closer. "The dispensary," he said. "What does it need?" Hannah blinked. Of all the things she had expected him to say, this was not among them. "I beg your pardon," she said. "The dispensary," he repeated. "Mr. Dawson mentioned that you assist there. I would like to know what supplies are lacking. What would be most useful?" Hannah stared at him. His face was serious, his gaze direct. He was not making small talk. He was asking a practical question, and he expected a practical answer. She hesitated. "There is always need." Bandages, tinctures, fever remedies. Specifically, the Duke said, "What would you order, if cost were no concern?" Hannah's mind raced. She thought of the shelves at the dispensary, the gaps where supplies should have been. She thought of the families who came in, desperate and afraid, and left empty-handed because there was nothing to give them. Quinine, she said finally, and willow bark. Laudanum for pain. Clean linen for bandages. Alcohol for disinfecting wounds. Cod liver oil for the children. The Duke nodded. Anything else? Herbs, Hannah said. Chamomile, peppermint, valerian root, and a good supply of soap. People don't realize how much illness comes from dirty hands. The Duke's mouth twitched, almost a smile. Soap, he repeated. Very well. He inclined his head, a gesture of acknowledgement, and turned to leave. Your Grace, Hannah said, surprising herself. He paused and looked back. Why are you asking me this? The Duke met her eyes. For a moment, he said nothing. Then quietly he replied, because I should have asked a year ago. He walked away before she could respond. Hannah stood in the churchyard, the cold wind tugging at her shawl, and watched him go. Her hands were trembling. Her chest felt tight. She did not know what had just happened. She did not know what it meant. But something had shifted. The silence between them had cracked, just slightly, and through that crack, something new had begun to grow. Over the following weeks, supplies began to arrive at the dispensary. They came in unmarked crates, delivered by a carter who said only that they had been ordered from Exeter. Mr. Dawson unpacked them with quiet satisfaction, noting each item in his ledger. Quinine, he said one afternoon, holding up a bottle, and willow bark, just as you suggested. Hannah said nothing. She continued sorting bandages, her hands steady. Strange coincidence, Mr. Dawson continued. The Duke orders supplies, and they happen to be exactly what you told him we needed. Hannah glanced at him. Did he say anything? Only that everything should be delivered without fuss, Mr. Dawson said. No ceremony, no announcements, just the supplies, quietly and efficiently. Hannah turned back to her work. Her throat felt tight again, that same strange pressure she had felt in the churchyard. The Duke was not seeking praise. He was not trying to repair his reputation. He was simply doing what needed to be done, as quietly as possible. It was not an apology. It was something more solid than that. It was action. It was responsibility, claimed without fanfare. And Hannah, despite herself, felt something stir in her chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition. The recognition that this man like her was carrying a weight he could not put down, and he was trying, in his own flawed way, to make it mean something. The collaboration began without discussion. There was no formal agreement, no moment when they decided to work together. It simply happened, gradually and naturally, like water, finding its way downhill. Hannah continued to volunteer at the dispensary, and she continued to notice what was needed. When the supply of bandages ran low, she mentioned it to the Duke after church one Sunday. He nodded and said nothing. The following week, a crate of clean linen arrived. When the winter cold set in and families began to fall ill, Hannah compiled a list of the most common ailments and the remedies that would help. She left the list with Mr. Dawson, who passed it along to the estate. Within days, the shelves were restocked. The Duke did not seek her out. He did not thank her or ask for her approval. He simply ensured that what she identified as necessary was provided. Their conversations, when they happened, were brief and practical. They spoke in the churchyard or on the road between the village and the estate. They did not discuss personal matters. They did not speak of loss or grief or the past. They talked about medicine, about supplies, about the needs of the village. And yet, something was building between them. It was not friendship, not yet. It was something quieter and more deliberate. It was respect. The village noticed, of course. Some approved. They saw the Duke's efforts and Hannah's involvement and believed it was a sign of healing, of the community coming together after hardship. Others were less charitable. They whispered that it was inappropriate for a widow to be seen so often with the Duke. They speculated about motives and intentions, weaving stories out of nothing more than proximity and coincidence. Hannah ignored the whispers. She had learned over the months to move through the world without caring what others thought. Her grief had made her untouchable, and she wore that untouchability like armor. But privately, In the quiet hours of the night, she wrestled with her own heart. Was it wrong to feel less alone? Was it a betrayal of Thomas's memory to find purpose again, to feel something other than the dull ache of loss? She did not have answers. She only knew that when she saw the Duke in the churchyard, when they spoke of practical things, and he listened with that same quiet intensity, she felt something she had not felt in a long time. She felt seen. The Duke, for his part, seemed to be undergoing his own transformation. He began attending village council meetings again, something he had not done since before his wife's illness. He sat at the back of the room and listened. He did not dominate the conversation or impose his will. He simply listened, and when he spoke, it was with careful consideration. The villagers were surprised. They had expected the Duke to return to his old role, to take charge and make decisions as his father had done. But this Duke was different. He was quieter, more measured. He seemed to understand that his authority was not absolute, that it had to be earned. Hannah attended one of the council meetings at Mr. Dawson's request. The pharmacist wanted to propose an expansion of the dispensary, and he thought Hannah's perspective would be valuable. She sat near the back, her hands folded in her lap, and listened as the men debated costs and logistics. The Duke sat across the room. He did not look at her, but she felt his presence like a weight in the air. When Mr. Dawson finished his proposal, the Duke spoke. "The dispensary serves the entire village," he said. "It is not a luxury. It is a necessity. Whatever funds are required, the estate will provide them." There was a murmur of approval. One of the councilmen asked about the specifics, and the Duke answered with calm precision. He had clearly thought through the details. He knew the costs, the logistics, the potential obstacles. Hannah watched him, and for the first time, she saw not the distant, grief-stricken man who sat in the same pew, but someone else, someone who was trying, despite his failures, to do better. After the meeting, as the villagers filed out into the cold night, the Duke approached her. He did not smile, but his expression was less guarded than usual. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Your insight was valuable." Hannah nodded. "Mr. Dawson asked me to attend." "Even so," the Duke said. He hesitated, as though considering his next words carefully. "I am grateful for your help. With the dispensary. With everything." Hannah looked at him. The street lamp cast shadows across his face, deepening the lines around his eyes. He looked tired, but there was something else there too. Something that might have been hope. "You are doing what is needed," she said quietly. "That is enough." The Duke's jaw tightened. He nodded once, sharply, and turned to leave. But as he walked away, Hannah felt that strange pressure in her chest again, that sense of something shifting, something changing. She did not know what it meant. But she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she was no longer alone in her grief. The midpoint came on a cold evening in December, at a village assembly held in the church hall. The room was crowded, every bench filled, the air thick with the smell of damp wool and candle smoke. The assembly had been called to discuss repairs to the village bridge, but the conversation had quickly turned to other matters. One of the vestrymen, a man named Carver, stood and addressed the room. He was a prosperous farmer, well-liked and respected, and when he spoke, people listened. "I want to acknowledge the Duke's efforts these past months," Carver said. "The dispensary is better stocked than it has been in years. The tenant cottages have been repaired. The roads are passable again. We are grateful." There was a murmur of agreement. Heads nodded. A few people glanced toward the Duke, who sat near the front, his face impassive. Carver continued. "It is good to see the estate fulfilling its responsibilities again. We have all suffered, but we are recovering, and that is due, in no small part, to His Grace's leadership." The Duke stood. The room fell silent. "I appreciate your words, Mr. Carver," the Duke said. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a sharpness that had not been there before. "But I must correct you. The estate did not fulfill its responsibilities. It failed." The silence deepened. People shifted in their seats, uncomfortable. The Duke continued, his gaze sweeping the room. "When my wife was ill, I left the estate in the hands of my steward. I believed that was sufficient. I was wrong. The steward did his best, but he did not have the authority or the resources to meet the needs of the village, and people suffered as a result." He paused. His jaw tightened. Children died. Families went without. The dispensary ran out of medicine. These are not abstract failures. They are real, and they had real consequences. And I am responsible. No one spoke. The room was so quiet that Hannah could hear the crackle of the fire in the hearth. The Duke's voice softened, but it did not lose its intensity. I do not say this to seek your forgiveness. I say it because it is the truth. I failed you. I failed this village. And I will carry that failure for the rest of my life. He sat down. The silence stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable. Then, slowly, people began to murmur. Some nodded. Others looked away, their faces troubled. Hannah sat at the back of the room, her hands clenched in her lap. Her chest felt tight, her breath shallow. She had not expected this. She had not expected him to speak so plainly, so honestly. She had not expected him to claim responsibility without excuse or justification. And in that moment, something broke open inside her. Not love, not yet, but something close to it. A recognition that this man, who had sat beside her in silence for nearly a year, understood the weight of what had been lost. He understood that grief was not something to be managed or minimized. It was something to be carried, honestly and without pretense. After the assembly, Hannah walked out into the cold night. The stars were bright overhead, the air sharp and clear. She pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders and began the walk home. She had not gone far when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned and saw the Duke approaching. He stopped a few paces away, his breath misting in the cold air. "Mrs. Moreland," he said, "may I walk with you?" Hannah hesitated, then nodded. They walked in silence for a time, their footsteps crunching on the frozen ground. The village was quiet, most families already inside for the night. The only sound was the wind rustling through the bare trees. Finally, the Duke spoke. "I must leave for several months." Hannah glanced at him, surprised. "There are matters in the north that require my attention," he continued. "Estate business, legal complications. I've delayed as long as I can, but I cannot delay any longer." Hannah nodded slowly. "When will you leave?" "Within the week." They walked on in silence. Hannah felt a strange sense of loss, though she could not have said why. The Duke had been a presence in her life for nearly a year, but they were not friends. They were not anything, really. Just two people who sat in the same pew and spoke occasionally of practical things. And yet, the thought of his absence unsettled her. "The dispensary will be well supplied," the Duke said. "I have made arrangements. And if there are any urgent needs, you may write to my steward. He will have the authority to act." "Thank you," Hannah said quietly. The Duke stopped walking. They were near the edge of the village, where the road forked toward her cottage. He turned to face her, his expression serious. "I do not ask you to wait," he said. "I do not ask you for anything. But I want you to know," he hesitated, as though the words were difficult. "I will return." Hannah looked at him. His face was shadowed, but she could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands clenched at his sides. "I believe you," she said. The Duke nodded once, sharply. Then he turned and walked back toward the estate, his figure disappearing into the darkness. Hannah stood alone on the road, the cold wind biting at her cheeks. She did not know what to make of his words. She did not know what they meant, or what they promised. But she knew, with a certainty that both frightened and comforted her, that something had changed. The silence between them was no longer a wall. It was a door, and it was beginning to open. Winter settled over Ashford like a heavy blanket. The days were short, the nights long and cold. Snow fell in thick, silent flakes, covering the fields and roads and rooftops. The village turned inward, families huddling around their fires, venturing out only when necessary. Hannah continued her routine. She rose each morning, tended her small garden as best she could, and walked to the dispensary 3 days a week. The work was steady, and she was grateful for it. It gave her something to focus on, something other than the emptiness of her cottage and the silence that filled it. The Duke was gone. He had left as he said he would, quietly and without ceremony. The village noticed his absence, but life went on. The steward managed the estate competently, and the supplies for the dispensary continued to arrive, as promised. Hannah did not write to the Duke. She did not know what she would say, and yet she thought of him often, not with longing exactly, but with a kind of steady awareness. She wondered where he was, what he was doing. She wondered if he thought of her. She did not speak of him to anyone. The village had enough gossip without her adding to it. But in the quiet hours of the evening, when she sat by her fire with her mending in her lap, she found herself remembering his words, "I will return." She did not know if she believed him. She did not know if it mattered. But the words stayed with her, a small light in the darkness. The winter was hard. Several families fell ill with influenza, and the dispensary was kept busy. Hannah worked long hours, assisting Mr. Dawson with preparing remedies and tending to the sick. The work was exhausting, but it was also purposeful. She felt, for the first time in months, that she was doing something that mattered. One evening, as she was cleaning up after a long day, Mr. Dawson spoke. "You've changed," he said. Hannah glanced at him, surprised. "Have I?" "You have," Mr. Dawson said. He was sorting bottles, his movements slow and deliberate. "When you first came here, after Thomas died, you were like a ghost. You moved through the world, but you weren't really here." Hannah looked down at her hands. She did not know what to say. But now Mr. Dawson continued, "You're different. You're present. You're engaged. It's good to see." Hannah's throat felt tight. "I don't know if I've changed," she said quietly. "I think I'm just learning to live again." Mr. Dawson nodded. "That's what change is, my dear. Learning to live again." Hannah finished her work in silence, but his words stayed with her. She thought about them as she walked home through the snow, as she sat by her fire and ate her simple supper. She thought about them as she climbed into bed and pulled the blankets up to her chin. Was she learning to live again? She did not know, but she knew that the grief, while still present, no longer consumed her. It was still there, a constant ache in her chest, but it was no longer the only thing she felt. She thought of Thomas, as she did every night. She remembered his laughter, his bright eyes, the way he had run through the cottage with boundless energy. She remembered the weight of him in her arms, the softness of his hair, the sound of his voice calling her name. And for the first time, the memories did not break her. They hurt, yes, they would always hurt, but they did not destroy her. She could hold them, gently and carefully, and still go on. She thought of the Duke, too. She thought of the way he had stood in the church hall and claimed responsibility for his failures. She thought of the way he had looked at her on the road, his face shadowed and serious, and said, "I will return." She did not know what would happen when he returned. She did not know if anything would happen, but she realized, as she lay in the darkness, that she wanted him to return. She wanted to see him again, to speak with him, to continue the quiet work they had begun together. It was not love, not yet, but it was something. It was hope. Late autumn came again, the leaves turning gold and red, the air crisp and clear. Hannah was working in the dispensary when Mr. Dawson looked up from his ledger and said, "The Duke has returned." Hannah's hands stilled. She set down the jar she had been holding and looked at him. "When?" "Yesterday, I believe," Mr. Dawson said. "The steward mentioned it this morning." Hannah nodded slowly. She returned to her work, but her mind was elsewhere. The Duke had returned. After months away, he was back. She did not know what to do with that information. She did not know if it changed anything, but her heart was beating faster, and she could not seem to calm it. Sunday came. Hannah walked to the church as she always did, her steps measured and deliberate. The morning was cold, the sky overcast. She entered the church and took her place in the third pew, on the left side. The service began. The vicar spoke, the congregation sang, and Hannah sat in silence, her hands folded in her lap. She did not look toward the side door. She did not let herself hope. And then, halfway through the service, she felt it. A presence, familiar and unmistakable. She glanced to her right. The Duke sat at the far end of the pew. He was thinner than she remembered, his face more drawn. But his eyes, when they met hers, were steady. He did not smile. He simply nodded, a small acknowledgement. Hannah's breath caught. She looked away, her heart pounding. She could not focus on the vicar's words. She could not think of anything except the man sitting beside her, separated by the width of grief and time and silence. After the service, she rose and walked toward the door. She did not look back. She did not know if he would follow. But as she stepped out into the cold air, she heard his voice. "Mrs. Moreland." She stopped. She turned. The Duke stood a few paces away, his hat in his hands. He looked at her steadily, without hesitation. "Will you walk with me?" he asked. Hannah's throat felt tight. She nodded. They walked in silence, leaving the village behind. The Duke led the way, and Hannah followed, her heart beating too fast. She did not know where they were going. She did not ask. They walked for perhaps 20 minutes, through fields, and along a narrow path that led into the estate grounds. Finally, they emerged into a garden. It was old, clearly neglected, but still beautiful. The trees were ancient, their branches spreading wide overhead. The grass was long and wild, dotted with fallen leaves. In the center of the garden was a stone bench, weathered and covered in moss. The Duke led her to it and gestured for her to sit. She did, her hands folded in her lap, her breath misting in the cold air. The Duke stood for a moment, looking out over the garden. Then he sat beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. For a long time, neither spoke. The wind rustled the leaves. A bird called in the distance. The world was quiet and still. Finally, the Duke spoke. "I thought of you often," he said. His voice was low, almost hesitant. "While I was away, I thought of this village, of the work we began, of you." Hannah looked at him. His profile was sharp against the gray sky, his expression serious. "I thought of you as well," she said quietly. The Duke turned to face her. His eyes were dark, filled with something she could not name. "I should have been there," he said, "when your son died, when the village needed me. I should have been there." Hannah's throat tightened. She looked down at her hands. "I cannot change the past," the Duke continued. "I cannot undo the harm that was done. But I can promise you this." He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I will not fail in silence again." Hannah looked up at him. His face was open, vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. He was not the distant, grief-stricken man who had sat in the pew beside her for a year. He was simply a man, flawed and broken, trying to do better. "Then remain," she said. Her voice was steady, though her heart was pounding. "Do not leave again." The Duke's breath caught. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw something like hope in his eyes. "I will remain," he said, "if you will let me." Hannah did not answer immediately. She looked out over the garden, at the ancient trees, and the wild grass, and the fallen leaves. She thought of Thomas, of the life she had lost, of the grief that had hollowed her out, and left her empty. And then she thought of the man beside her, who had carried his own grief with quiet dignity, who had tried, in his own flawed way, to make amends, who had returned, as he said he would. "I will let you," she said. The Duke's hands trembled. He removed one glove, slowly, and reached for her hand. His fingers were warm against hers, his touch gentle. "May I?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Hannah nodded. The Duke leaned closer. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch reverent, as though she were something precious and fragile, and then he kissed her. It was not urgent. It was not passionate. It was deliberate, careful, a promise made without words. His lips were warm against hers, and she felt something inside her break open, something she had kept locked away for so long. When he pulled back, his eyes were bright. "I will not fail you," he said. "I know," Hannah whispered. They sat together on the stone bench, the wind stirring the leaves around them, the light slanting gold through the branches. The world remained whole, but they were no longer alone. Spring came slowly to Ashford. The snow melted, the fields turned green, and the trees began to bud. The village woke from its winter slumber, and life resumed its familiar rhythms. Hannah and the Duke were seen together often. They walked through the village, attended council meetings, and worked together at the dispensary. They did not hide their relationship, but neither did they flaunt it. They simply were, present and steady, a quiet partnership built on shared loss and mutual respect. The village had stopped whispering. Some had even begun to smile when they saw them together. It was clear, to anyone who cared to look, that this was not a scandal or a betrayal. It was something deeper, something more enduring. It was two people who had been broken by grief and had chosen, slowly and carefully, to rebuild. Hannah continued her work at the dispensary, and the Duke continued to oversee the estate. But now they shared the work. They shared the silence. And sometimes they shared words. One Sunday in late spring, they sat together in the third pew. It was the same pew they had occupied for nearly a year. But now they sat side by side, their shoulders almost touching. Before the service began, Hannah reached into her basket and pulled out a small bunch of wildflowers. She placed them on the edge of the pew, a quiet tribute to Thomas. The Duke saw the gesture and bowed his head. He did not ask. He did not need to. They did not erase the past. They honored it. And in doing so, they allowed themselves to live. After the service, they walked together through the churchyard. The sun was warm, the air filled with the scent of blooming flowers. Hannah felt lighter than she had in years, as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "Do you ever think about the future?" the Duke asked. Hannah glanced at him. "Sometimes." "What do you see?" Hannah considered the question. She thought of her cottage, of the dispensary, of the village she had called home for so long. She thought of Thomas, of the love she had lost, and the love she had found. "I see a life," she said finally. "Not perfect, not without pain, but a life worth living." The Duke smiled. It was a small smile, but it was genuine. "That is all I want," he said. "A life worth living. With you." Hannah took his hand. "Then we will build it together." They walked on, through the churchyard and into the village, side by side. The world stretched out before them, full of possibility and hope. They did not know what the future held, but they knew, with a certainty that had been forged in grief and tempered by time, that they would face it together. And that was enough. Love, in its truest form, does not erase grief. It makes space for it. It allows the past to coexist with the present, memory to walk hand in hand with hope. Hannah Moreland and the Duke of Renborough did not replace those they had lost. They learned to live in a world where sorrow and joy could exist side by side, where the weight of the past did not crush the promise of the future. The same pew that had once held two isolated mourners now held two people who had chosen one another, not because they had forgotten, but because they had remembered, and still found the courage to begin again. In the garden at Renborough Hall, the stone bench beneath the ancient oak became a place of peace. The leaves returned with the changing seasons, falling and rising in an endless cycle. And in that cycle, there was a kind of grace. The world turned, the seasons changed, and two people who had been broken by loss learned, slowly and carefully, to be whole again, not by erasing the past, but by honoring it and choosing to live.